Much for joining us today to learn more about the EA. I assume many of you are in the final stage of submitting an application, or some of you are just preparing for the next year's intake. So, this is a good start to investigate one important part of the application process, which is the EA test. My name is Elena, and I'm the current admissions officer for the Executive MBA program. And I will be the host for you along with Grace from Manhattan Prep, who will answer to the question, what is the EA? Explain the key points, and also try with you some sample questions.
Hi, everybody.
Mind that for the executive MBA's programs, the EA is a diagnostic tool, and we look for an average of 150 with at least 10 in quants. Also, please feel free to submit your questions as the webinar carries on, and we will be able to answer them at the end for the Q&A session. As a starting point, before going into the technicalities of the test itself, I would like to briefly present the Executive MBA programs we have here at LBS. Firstly, studied over 20 months, the Executive MBA provides a grounding in all areas of business and management. EMBA London and Dubai has 2 intakes per year, one in January and one in September, with around 12 years of experience. London and Dubai offer first-class access to the world's most influential markets, organizations, and business leaders. Elect to complete your studies is one of the 2 campuses, bringing to the attention that the format for each campus is different. Classes for London run on Fridays and Saturdays, while the one in Dubai goes for 1 block week each month. However, LBS faculty members travel to both centers to ensure a fully aligned curriculum. On the other side, EMBA Global combines the expertise of 3 exceptional business schools with the opportunity to study in the world's most important economic capitals, London, New York, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. The program has 1 intake per year in May and is taught over 4 or 5 days residential class weeks at LBS and Columbia Business School for Global America and Europe, and also at the University of Hong Kong for Global Asia. After graduating, students will receive a dual MBA degree. For all our programs, the EA is part of the application process. Therefore, if you wish to apply, I would advise you to start taking some notes on the next slides, as the information presented will help you secure a good score. Now I will hand over to Grace.
Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Truewortha, and I am an instructor with Manhattan Prep, and I teach a variety of exams, one of which is the executive assessment. And many of my students in my executive assessment courses actually do have a bit of familiarity with another exam called the GMAT, as many of these EA students are frequently 10, 11, 12 years from undergraduate, having been in the work environment for much longer, as Elena noted on the previous slide. They may have looked at getting an MBA at some point earlier in their careers and may have started looking at the GMAT. So some of the things I'm going to go into here have a little bit more, I'm going to share with you as a difference from the GMAT, because I know that many of you may have some familiarity with that other exam. As Elena said, please do enter your questions, and we will try to get to them at the end of class. At the end of the workshop. I've been a longtime instructor with Manhattan Prep, and I do have my MBA from Harvard Business School, and I taught for them at the very beginning of my career and then worked for a long time in industry, and then have now returned to teaching for them, as I'm also starting and building my own company here in the States. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin, which is about 3 hours outside of Chicago, for those of you who are familiar with the States. But welcome to everybody. So the exam basics, as Elena said, it is definitely a test that you should do some preparation for. It is an hour and a half, so it's 90 minutes, and it's 90 minutes straight. I always refer to the EA as the little cousin of the GMAT, because the content of the exam is actually very close to that in the GMAT, but it is shorter. It is only 90 minutes versus a much longer 3+ hour exam on the other side. It is more expensive. It does have a very different scoring range, and that scoring range is, the exam itself professes a scoring range between 100 to 200, but we believe that there is a practical scoring range, an effective scoring range that tops out really at 174. I don't even know that it goes to 180. Our instructors are quite familiar with the exam, and as of yet, we find that regardless of how you perform, there is essentially a cap at about 174. So Elena talked a little bit about the score that LBS is looking for, and we'll go into how the test is scored and how you get to, say, that 150. The average score at top EMBA programs is right around there, though they don't really release that information. Schools have kept that information pretty close to the chest, understandably, but we hear from a lot of programs, and we'll go into some of them shortly, about the scores that they're looking for in their incoming classes. You can only take the exam twice. This is very important. I've had a few, it's very different from the GMAT, which you can actually take multiple times, but you can only take the test twice, max. And so that needs to play a role in your mindset as you prepare for the exam, that there are only two seatings for any individual. And then lastly, the reschedule policy is fairly generous. You have up until 24 hours before the exam to reschedule your exam. Between more than 48 hours before your exam, there's actually no fee. Between 24 and 48 hours, they do charge you $75 to reschedule it. So that is the exam basics. So in terms of the scoring and how the exam actually works, it is a 90-minute exam. And again, the note at the top there about the overall score is from the folks at the EA itself. And so you can see that they have publicly given out information that the score goes up to 200. Again, I think the effective cap or top score right now is around 174. It is 3 sections. The IR section, which is what you see on the screen here, and the IR section is 30 minutes. So each of the 3 sections is 30 minutes, and you receive a score for the IR section between 0 and 20. I've never seen a score above 18, even with our instructors. So again, this is where our belief in what the true cap of the score is versus what they've publicly stated. It's not really relevant right now since they don't release any percentiles for those scores, but at some point in the future, we may get different information here. So the IR section itself is composed of 12 questions split between 2 panels. And the way it works is, and it always starts with IR, the order of the exam never changes. Those 6 questions, you can move around within that first panel. So you can move ahead, you can go back to questions that you've answered, and that first panel is of what we call mixed difficulty. After you finish those first 6 questions, you will then move yourself into the second panel of 6 questions. And once you do that, you cannot go back to the first panel. So once you move from panel to panel, that's it. You can't go back. And it's important to be cognizant of time because the exam will not move you to the second panel at, say, the midpoint of those 30 minutes. The onus is on you to actually propel yourself into the second panel. And that can be challenging for students because, you know, they want to do a good job on those first 6 problems. And so it's easy to spend too much time there and not give yourself sufficient time for the second panel of 6 questions. And this is true for IR, it's true for the verbal section, which comes next, and it's true for quant, which is the last section. Now, between sections, after 30 minutes, the test will automatically move you to the next section. So from IR to verbal and verbal to quant. And you'll see on this slide that depending on your performance in the first panels of each section does drive your performance on the second, does drive which second panel you get. You will not necessarily get a panel of equal difficulty for the second panel. Ideally, you would like to get a harder panel. This is the adaptive in adaptive testing. Because the test is changing, depending on how you perform, you do not need to have in your mind that you need to get everything correct to get some of those competitive scores. And I believe that once you get into, say, a harder panel for the second panels, there is essentially a floor to your section score because you have actually done well enough to get these harder questions. And so you can't look at straight number right, number wrong, whether in your preparation or on practice exams, because it is not a linear scoring scale. There is an element of adaptivity to your performance. Now, speaking of that score, the way the scoring works is they essentially take your section scores. So say you get a 10 in IR, a 10 in verbal, and a 10 in quant. The way you get your total score, that 150 that Elena alluded to earlier, is they just add those 3 section scores to 120. So they take, say, IR 10, verbal 10, quant 10, that's 30. 30 plus 120 is 150. So that is one way to get to a 150. Most students have different performance levels in each of the 3 sections, so it's certainly not surprising. It's expected that you would get to 150 in different ways. But the point she made about quant, I think, is an important one, in that many of the top programs do look for a quant minimum. So you can't necessarily do well in IR and verbal and neglect quant for a lot of these programs. A couple of practical implications based on how the test works. The skill that the EA really is going toward is something that I call executive reasoning. And this is something that I think most of you probably perform in your day-to-day jobs and at a very high level. And that is, you're analyzing information, you're using the clues around you, you're thinking flexibly, and often you're willing to change your mind. At the heart of it, all of what we do is essentially looking around us for potential opportunities for our time and money. And we are looking for things that give us the biggest return on investments of that time and money. Same thing with the EA. Same thing with the EA. The EA is giving you mini opportunities, right? Questions. 6 of them in the first IR panel, 6 of them in the second IR panel, 7 in each of the quant and verbal panels. Yes, that is accurate. There's one more question in each of the quant and verbal panels in the same amount of time. And you need to be willing to move on if where you're at is not a great use of your time and mental energy, the finite resources you have for the exam. So in that sense, it is very similar to many of the activities that we do professionally on a day-to-day basis. So executive reasoning is the key. And again, you are not expected to get everything right. You have to sometimes make the call on, is this a losing proposition? Should I just cut my losses and move on? And in many cases, the answer to that question is yes. All 3 areas are important. Those of you who are a little bit more familiar with the GMAT is on a very different scoring scale. And on that scoring scale, which is 200 to 800, the quant and verbal sections are the only ones that influence that score. So IR is separate from the GMAT. In the EA, the IR is definitely equally weighted as quant and verbal. And so in a sense, I personally think that's a good thing. I think IR questions tend to help student scores. But at the same time, it's not universal. The IR is a very dense section in terms of the information that you get. And so because it is in English, some students find those to be more challenging if, say, English is not your native language. So there is that piece. But these are all the considerations, as you look to prepare and take the test. Lastly, don't spend too much time on any one problem. you can miss a lot and still get a good score, especially if you do well on the first panels in each section, and then you actually get a harder second panel. So if you recall here, you'll notice that your IR result, so IR stands for integrated reasoning. It integrates verbal and quant skills. So your performance on that section as a whole does play a small role in the first panel you get for both verbal and quant. And then once you finish those first verbal and quant sections, you will get a second section whose difficulty level is going to be dependent on your performance in the first one. All right, so again, these are the, let me just get here. Here are the test sections. IR, mix of quant and verbal. It is the only section where you're allowed to use a calculator. And it is an on-screen calculator. So it is not a physical calculator that the test center gives you. It is an on-screen one. It's fairly basic 4-function calculator. There are 4 different types of IR questions in those 12 total questions. So 4 different types. Next is verbal. It's always the second section of the exam. And there are 3 different types of questions within here, which certainly in all of our courses and materials we go into, and also is available through the executive assessment website. Has free questions in all of these areas to give you a flavor and a sample for what you'll see. And then lastly, quant, always the third section, 2 different types of questions. Calculator not allowed. That's very important. You are not allowed to use a calculator in the quant section of the exam. I would argue you don't really need to. The kinds of questions, they're really trying to see how well you analyze information and use clues that the EA gives you, clues that may indicate a method of solving that doesn't require a calculator. So again, even in IR, I don't find myself frequently using the calculator, and I encourage many of my students to not be dependent on it, because I think it can be a detriment to your actual thought process in approaching the problems. All right, so what content? So there's 4 types of IR questions, 3 types of verbal questions, 2 types of quant questions. What do those questions actually test you on? Within verbal, you'll get these 3 types of questions: sentence correction, reading comprehension, and something called critical reasoning, which tests logical reasoning. Okay, so the name of the problem type is critical reasoning, but what it actually tests is logical reasoning. Now, within sentence correction, you are tested on grammar, and those are the grammar rules that do come up on the exam, a sampling of them. I would say this is the majority of them, though of course I left the ... because they'll always have a surprise or 2 on their exam. And then within quant, here are the 2 types of questions: problem solving and data sufficiency. I would say problem solving are your standard math questions that you've probably seen on many other admissions or types of exams that you've taken. 5 answer choices, you do the problem, you select the answer choice. Data sufficiency is unique to the EA and the GMAT, and those do take a little bit more time to get the handle of. So we do spend quite a good amount of time going through data sufficiency, but both of these question types test the same math content. And it is not what I would call advanced math content. The topics tested, at least in American schools, you've probably covered by the time you're in 10th grade, by the time you're 15 years old. And so there's no collegiate level math. There's no what I would call more advanced math. It's actually fairly basic. So, but of course, this being the EA, they ask about basic things in very odd manners. So part of what you're learning is really understanding what the EA is actually asking you. And that may be actually fairly challenging, even if the math content itself is not. All right, so to summarize, they are testing executive reasoning. Are you able to assess the potential ROI or return on investment of a question? Are you able to recognize that a question will take too long or that you are unlikely to answer correctly? If you recall from the exam structure, we had 30 minutes to do 12 questions in IR. Okay, so 6 in the first panel, 6 in the second panel. That's not a long time. And our strategy to combat the time pressure is actually to actively look out for opportunities to bail on a question. Essentially, read a question, assess that information, analyze it, and make the decision right then and there to select an answer choice and skip it. So instead of doing 6 and 6 in IR in those 30 minutes, you're doing 5 and 5, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but it does increase your per question time from 2.5 minutes to 3 minutes. And that can make a pretty significant difference in IR. So our strategy in my classes is essentially you're looking to bail on about 1 question per panel. So 6 becomes 5, 7 becomes 6. And in doing so, you are marshaling your finite resources toward better investments, because everybody is going to be stumped on the exam, even me. The difference is I figure that out very quickly, and I can make the subsequent right choices from a total score perspective. That's right. Failing. Knowing when to give up, a key skill on the EA and in life. In short, can you make the best executive decisions for the situation facing you on the screen? Be willing to change your mind. Like, I've started problems and then realized, a couple a couple seconds in that, oh, you know what, this is not going where I expected it to go. So I just need to cut my losses, change my mind, and put it from the do column to the guess column. In regards to programs, so the EA is actually a relatively new exam. It was developed in 2015, I believe, and has slowly gained adoption and fans from executive MBA programs. And that was the market that the EA was developed for. Many very busy executives, 10 to 12 years into their careers, they are at peak career point, and it was difficult for a lot of them to take the time, energy out of their schedule to devote to the GMAT, which was formerly what many EMBA programs required. And so essentially the GMAC took this feedback and developed this new exam that essentially assessed the same skills, but in a more, in a less burdensome way. And so that's how the executive assessment came about. And now I would say most of the top programs do accept the EA for their executive MBA programs, including LBS, Columbia, Sloan, some of their partners, Wharton, University of Chicago, Booth, and quite a few others, all of which are on the executive assessment, the EA website, if you are curious about which schools are open to the executive assessment. So check the websites of those desired programs. I would say you want to look for their policies and make your testing decisions accordingly. Some of them do only accept the GMAT still. So no EA, GMAT only. Some of them accept the EA, but they have a GMAT preference, and they will usually be fairly upfront with this information. I always say go to the source, talk to the admissions officers, talk to the Elenas out there, and let them, they gain nothing by not telling you what their policies are. Some of them will have no preference, which is, if there is no preference, I would counsel you. I wish the EA was around when I went to get a traditional MBA, but had I been looking at an executive MBA, for sure I would have taken the executive assessment. It is a very discernible burden difference between the EA and the GMAT. And even better, they accept the EA, but they actually they accept both the EA and the GMAT, but they actually prefer the EA. And I believe LBS, London Business School, actually falls in this last category. All right, we did promise you some actual questions. Now, the first one I'm going to give you is from the IR section. So this would be the very first thing you sit down and see when you take the exam. And I don't think it's an accident that the exam throws IR at you at the beginning. They are trying to throw you off their game. They know that these students are taking this exam, are likely to be quite successful in their chosen fields and move through their work life in a fairly, competent, confident manner. And so they're going to try and throw you like off your game from the start and give you a scenario that you've probably never dealt with in real life, and you have to sit there and figure out this information. Oh, and by the way, you have to do it in 3 minutes. Okay, so this is what I think is actually a fairly typical IR question, and I will give you about 3 minutes to read through it and select an answer choice. Let me just. Right. The type of question it is it's called a two-part. So as I mentioned, there are 4 types of IR questions. This is the type called two-part. I will let you have a go at it, and then I'll go through it. Okay, about a minute left. Okay, that is time up. That's 3 minutes, which is, if you adopt our bail strategy, which is be on the lookout for that one problem, that's a terrible investment of your time and mental energy, is about what you'll have for each of the remaining 5 questions per IR panel. So you can see here that there is a calculator in the IR section, and you would click on that button, and a calculator, this is a static slide, so it wouldn't work here. But if you click on that calculator word, the calculator will pop up on screen, and then you'll be able to use it for this problem. But as I mentioned before, I try not to depend on it or do any calculations, because essentially it's not really a calculation friendly exam. So right off the bat, I always say there's a rite of passage, your first IR question, and many of them are very similar to this one in terms of they give you a ton of information, sometimes about things that you've never even heard of, which at least they're pretty upfront about. This is a fictitious science news report about a fictitious type of location. They literally tell you these things are not taken from reality. And you are to read this, understand it, and absorb it to the point where you can then answer this question. And this is one question. It's called 2 parts because there are 2 columns, and your task is to select one choice, one selection from each column. Okay? And it's asking you, in this case, for something you can infer. Okay, what can you infer from that previous paragraph? And we talk a lot about inference on the EA because it may mean something, and it seems like it means something very different than how a lot of people interpret the word, I call it in real life, the word inference on the EA. So we have to make sure as you're studying and preparing for the exam that you understand exactly what your task is here. So we are looking for one selection in each column that must happen and must not happen for this fictitious location to be a Morafa. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So I'll give you an example of the kinds of inferences you're allowed to make. Like what kind of conclusions can you make from the text? So if you take a look at this line, they have abandoned the area to establish their nests. Okay, if they leave this area to establish their nests are not in the area. Their nests are not in this fictitious location called a Morafa. And so that is actually the answer choice for the column does not happen in this location or must not happen in this location. Okay, and then the correct answer for must happen is gathering together with members of their own species because they are able to, researchers are able to observe the species' social hierarchy. Okay, so there is the proof in the previous paragraph that supports your selection, one in each column. And the thing about IR is that there is no partial credit. Many types of IR questions, many of the 4 types of IR questions have multiple parts to them, yet there is no partial credit. It's all or nothing. You have to get the right one for in this example, the right one for the first column and the right one for the second column. Good times. Okay, now IR is called integrated reasoning because you are integrating verbal skills, in many cases reading a lot of information, but some of the questions are quant questions. So this one I would put in the basket of more verbal type IR questions, but there will also be quant type IR questions. So even though the skills you're deploying are both verbal and quant, the actual individual questions themselves you should be able to categorize as one or the other. All right. There it is, correct answer. All right, so that's IR. So let's now look to a verbal question, which is the second section of the exam. You do have one more verbal question in each panel than I are. There are 7, which if you think you're going to bail, 7 becomes 6. So you do 6 and 6 in the 30 minutes of verbal. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes here, so a little bit less than your average per question time, to give you a chance to look at this one. This one is sentence correction. This is sentence correction, one of the 3 types of verbal questions, and this is the one that tests grammar. There's about 30 seconds. Okay, that was about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. So we need to build our minutes sense of time, because they will pass very quickly on the exam. And I actually encourage my students that they need to practice in a timed condition from pretty much from the very beginning. So whatever preparation you follow, I think it's better to work in the time allotted and just try and speed up your work from the beginning, rather than try and learn material and give yourself lots of time to do some of these problems and try and speed up, because I think that's a much harder road. I think you need to try and do these problems quickly from the beginning and then just train yourself to do them in the time you have, rather than, oh, I want to learn the material first and take my time and get all these grammar rules. But you have to learn to spot things quickly. And that's what you do in a question like this, spot things quickly. So again, this is sentence correction, which is one of the 3 types of verbal questions. And here, when I say spot things quickly, one of the things that you want to spot are differences among the answer choices. And you see that 3 of the choices begin with rice, and 2 of them begin with the protein. I'm sorry, 3 of them begin with rice, and 2 of them begin with the protein in rice. And many times in sentence correction, differences among the answer choices are clues as to what the grammar errors are. Okay, so the way sentence correction works is part or all of a sentence is underlined, and your task is to choose the most correct form of the underlined portion given what the author is trying to say. So choice A always repeats the original underlined portion, and then choices B through D give you other options for that underlined portion. So we talk about in our classes about looking for a split in the answer choices that might push you toward one or the other. And there is definitely a call on grammar here. The sentence here, and I'm not going to go into every issue, multiple issues are usually tested in any single sentence correction problem. I'm not going to go into all of them, but you'll see that the the sentence starts with a modifier, a descriptive phrase. In addition to having more protein than wheat does. So that describes something. Something is described as having more protein than wheat does. Okay? And one of the rules with modifiers, which is what that descriptive phrase is, it's a modifier of a noun. It describes a noun. What's being described as having more protein than wheat does is rice. Rice is what has more protein than wheat. So the rule with modifier issues, if you're describing a noun, that noun needs to be as close as possible to that modifier. So we see that in 3 of the choices, the actual underlined portion starts with the word rice, and that's actually what you need, because that's actually what's described as having more protein than wheat. If you start the underlined portion of that sentence with the protein in rice, which is what the original sentence does, they're essentially comparing the protein in rice to wheat. We don't compare the protein in rice to wheat. We compare rice to wheat. That is the logical comparison. We can compare the protein in rice to the protein in wheat, okay, but we cannot compare, logically at least, rice to a rice, the actual grain, to something in the grain. That is not logical. Okay, so that is an example of a grammar issue in this sample verbal question. All right. I think we have time. One more. I'm just going to show it to you. So we're not going to spend that much time on it because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But here's a sample quant question. So again, first section is IR, second section is verbal, third section is quant. Within quant, there are problem solving and data sufficiency. Those are the 2 types. This is your traditional problem solving question, dealing with rates. Okay, so I'll just let you read through it, but we're not going to spend too much time here because I think problem solving problems, I think, are a little bit more familiar to more students. You know, usually with many questions in quant, there are usually multiple approaches that will yield an answer, a correct answer. And what I always say is you need to be flexible, right? That's one of those executive reasoning skills, is to think flexibly, because while there may be multiple approaches that you could take towards any of these questions, they are probably not equal in terms of their likelihood to get a correct answer. You know, not all strategies are equally attractive for all questions. You have to recognize and train yourself to recognize, oh, what are the features of this problem that push me toward solving it in this particular way? Okay, so that flexibility there can be an asset on the exam. All right, so next step for all of you potentially are to contact us. You can start with questions here. I know Elena's been collecting them, and we are happy to discuss anything, as I know the folks at LVS are also. I'm a big advocate of, if you have questions, go to the admissions department. They are the best resources, you know. Start with their publicly available information, but get in touch. I think in my workings with them, all of them are very happy to sit down with potential students and applicants and candidates and help them out, help them prepare a competitive, compelling application process. So I will turn it back over. There's just a couple of slides here. You can get more information about our courses and our tutoring on our website, but they are very similar to our GMAT courses, but they're shorter, as befits an exam that is much shorter. This is our most popular offering, and we do also offer one-on-one tutoring, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I wish you all the best of luck in your future studies.
Great, thank you, Grace. So if you do have more questions for Grace or for me at this point, you can still submit them now, as we will be wrapping up in a couple of minutes. We have here a question from Ralph, who is asking for non-native English speakers. Is it advisable to prepare for and take the TOEFL first in order to prepare better for the verbal part? I think Grace can answer to this question.
Yeah, I do think so because the TOEFL is from an English language perspective sort of a more of a baseline exam. Though I have had students who take the actual, say, GRE or EA first. And what happens is if you study for the GRE and EA, your verbal performance must improve. And so the TOEFL becomes much less of a burden. But that's possible that you could take it in that order because you end up taking the TOEFL second, but it's a much easier exam at that point because you've done the preparation for the GRE and the or the EA or the GMAT or whatever exam is also required. So that has been done before and it can work that way. But usually the TOEFL requires a level that's slightly lower than some of these other exams. And because of that, it is a good idea to start with that. But it's not impossible to do it the other way.
Good, thank you. Then we have another question. What about the minimum requirements about English language tests like TOEFL or IELTS? So I can answer to that. For our leadership programs, if you have been living in UK for the past 3-4 years, you don't need to take English tests. If you do need to take one, if you are outside the UK, I think the average for IELTS can be around 7. So I think this answers your question. Then we have another one. What is the average EA score to pass LBS loan program? As said earlier, will be around 150 with at least 10 quants. So it's going to be like the same. Then from Rupal, if we need more practice for EA than provided by GMAT materials, can we study via GMAT questions? So this is for.
I can answer that, Elena.
Yes.
Absolutely. For many of my tutoring students, once we've exhausted EA materials, we move on to GMAT, and they are very similar. They test almost exactly the same content. The problem types are exactly the same. And if anything, the EA tests slightly less content. So geometry, geometric figures is not tested on the EA and it is tested on the GMAT. So definitely I actually move my students to GMAT official materials because they are the same essentially. In fact, I've been teaching these tests long enough that I can see when the EA has reused GMAT materials from very long ago into their official prep materials now. So that is a good plan.
Good. We are still open for questions, so if you do have any more questions, please submit them. There's another one from Vicky who is asking, what is a good score in EA? As mentioned earlier, an average score that we are looking for is 150 with at least 10 in quants. The quant side is maybe the most important one, but don't underestimate the others as well. So yeah, 150 for the. Then another one, how much time should be altered to each question? I think they're referring to the EA as well. So Grace, if you can.
Sure. There are, I would say there are, so there are 6 questions in each panel of IR, but we recommend our students essentially skip one of them in each panel, so that becomes 5 and 5. So if you think about 5 and 5 in IR in 30 minutes, that's about the 3 minutes per IR question that I alluded to earlier. It's not going to feel like enough, RuPaul and everybody else, I can tell you. And that the question we went through today about the fictional species, that is actually, I think, one of the less dense problems that I've seen. There are ones where you get much more information. So that's the timing guidelines in IR. In verbal and quant, I would say on average, you're looking to spend about 2.5 minutes per question. And that's, again, if you adopt the Bale strategy, which is to turn 7 questions in each panel to 6. So you have 12 total in the 30 minutes. Again, that's 2.5 minutes per problem. But it's not going to be, exactly 2.5 minutes per problem. That's unrealistic to expect. And I would say I advise my students to try and use that time strategically. So sentence correction, which is the type of problem we looked at today in regards to verbal, they can take less time sometimes, and so that gives you more time per question for the other 2 types of verbal question. So that is part of your preparation strategy, is to think about how to best use that 30 minutes. Which investments should you choose?
Thank you. Another one for you, Grace. Nicholas is asking if I assume there is a lot of crossover between the prep material available from GMAC and the available from the Manhattan Prep.
Yeah, at Manhattan Prep, we believe very much in official materials. So we actually purchase official materials for our students and include them in our courses. So there was only really crossover if you started prepping on your own and you already purchased the official materials, because they come with class also. So in that sense, yes, you could have more, but it's the same material, and so we encourage the use of official materials. That's the source of your exam, so it makes sense that that's how you would also prepare.
Great. If there are no other questions, we will end up here. Thank you, Grace, and thank you everyone who have joined this webinar, and we wish you the best of luck.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.